First of all, thanks very much for joining the session, where we will be providing an introduction to the Common Network Asset Indices methodology, or common methodology. This is the first in an 8-part webinar series that we'll be putting together to essentially showcase the common methodology and take a deeper dive into it as we go through the sessions. Just some housekeeping, just to let you know, we are recording this session today. Just a very quick introduction from myself. I'm Chris Given. I'm strategic bid manager and work in our insights business here at EA Technology, where we support businesses with strategic decision making through a range of consultancy services and software solutions. I'm very pleased to introduce Joanne Peacock, who will be delivering this presentation today. Joanne heads up our asset investment management team and also led the team responsible for the implementation of the original common methodology for each of the distribution network operators here in Great Britain. Obviously, we continue to support the development of the methodology, both on the methodology itself, and we also support the UK network operators with software solutions that we provide. Obviously, Joanne has a vast amount of experience supporting organisations in this field, and obviously I'm very pleased to hand over to Joanne for this session with a vast experience and knowledge in this area. So let's take a look quickly at some of the key takeaways for the session. We're hoping to explain what the common methodology is and why it was created. Help provide understanding of the shape and the structure and contents of the methodology, and to explore what asset categories are included in the GB methodology, and equally to provide further detail about the upcoming webinars in the series, where, as I say, we'll be taking a little bit of a deeper dive into the relevant sections. So the webinar itself for today, we anticipate about 50 minutes for the bulk presentation, and leaving plenty of time for questions and answers at the end. Joanne, I'm sure you don't mind me saying, if you do have questions throughout, please do either pop them in the chat or raise your hand, and we can come to you at the appropriate time during the session. So trusting that all sounds okay with everybody, I'll hand you over to Joanne. Thanks, Joanne.
Thanks, Chris. So yes, so good afternoon. Yeah, nice to have you join us this afternoon. Like I say, feel free to put your cameras on if you're not shy. Feel free to chat or raise your hand as we go through this session. So bit of an introduction to start with. So I know a few people who've registered and joined on the call have some experience in the common methodology itself, so hopefully you will learn something new through this session, and hopefully as we go through the series of webinars we can introduce some of the concepts and take a deeper dive into those concepts, and I'll show you a bit more about what we're planning to do in the coming sessions a little bit later on. So for now, just a bit of an introduction really. So key questions in the electricity sector. So this applies not just for electricity, but also we've been starting to work with other industries, so some renewables industries, and also we are starting to apply this into the water industry now, and you've all got similar sorts of challenges. And so some of the key questions that we got asked right at the beginning of our asset management journey, I've put them on this slide, so we'll quickly go through them. So what assets do you urgently need to get off your system? So which are the ones that are giving you the biggest headache? How can we model our asset experience? So this is quite a common question that we know engineers have so much information in their heads, but actually putting that down on paper and making something that's really logical and organised in the form of an argument to then put forward potentially for investment funding is actually quite difficult. So as we explore the methodology, you'll see how it becomes a communication tool as well, and not just a whoever shouts the loudest gets the funds for the work that they need to do. So we're looking at using that engineering experience and actually tapping into that into the models. Then we've got, how do we justify spending money on our assets? So just touched upon that really. How does the methodology support that? And we'll explore that more as we go through the sessions. How do we predict asset condition behaviour now and in the future? Well, this is the core essentially of what the common methodology does. What are the significant safety risks on our network? There is a safety element of the common methodology. We explore that as part of the consequences. And from that, you can take a little bit of a deeper dive into the models to have a look and see where those biggest safety concerns actually exist. And then we've got how much can we reduce our expenditure and not impact for future performance. And this is the real crux of it. And I think if we had a crystal ball and we could tell exactly when an asset was going to fail and replace it just before that happened, then common methodology probably wouldn't exist. But we don't have that. And so what we do have is a really structured and organised way of assessing the condition and behaviour of assets and their risk of failure, and understanding what happens to assets into the future so that we can then plan for a certain scenario. And we won't stop every failure on the network, that's impossible. But what we try and do is make the best of our funds that we have available to us and make the right investment decisions and be able to communicate those with stakeholders and regulators. So where all this started was in a process called condition-based risk management, and we developed that within EA Technology, and we sold that to markets around the world, predominantly in the UK and Australia and New Zealand and some Eastern countries. And so condition-based risk management was, in a nutshell, I've put the description on there, so it's a structured process that combines asset information, engineering knowledge and practical experience to define both the present day and likely future condition, performance and risk for physical assets. So it's got quite a broad remit. And then I've put the major components just to show you how they fitted together within CBRM. And as we go through and look at CNAIM, the common methodology, you'll see there's a strong relationship there, and there's a reason for that. And the reason is because common methodology was born out of CBRM, and the timeline just shows you the evolution of the methodology. So we first started creating condition-based risk management models way back in 2000. And this is where companies came to us and said exactly those sorts of questions and how can you help? And so we devised and evolved and researched the methodology. We tried it out on mostly GB network operators, and we improved it, and we kept on making improvements to it until the network operators were all using CBRM, and they were all producing their business plans using CBRM and submitting those to the regulator. And then in about 2015, 14-15, the regulator in the UK, so this is Ofgem, said, well, this is great, but what we don't have is you've all tuned the methodology to how you see it fits within your organisation, so to your perspective, and you've all got different costs and different risks, and we can't benchmark you against each other. And recognises this was a really powerful mechanism for funding. They said, right, go away and create a common methodology. And so for the distribution companies, that was quite easy because they were all using CBRM. So what they had to agree on was what data points they collected, how they would be weighted, what algorithms they were going to use. But most of those answers to those things were already in CBRM anyway. So they could just take the best bits and the common bits of what they had. And it's fair to say that some companies lagged behind other companies, and in terms of collecting data and their knowledge of the methodology. And so what you find in CBRM is it's the minimum working best estimate at asset health that we could produce here in Great Britain. So you might look at the methodology and say, oh, I collect this data and I collect this data, and that would be really interesting and useful to include in the health or the criticality part of the methodology. But those are excluded potentially because it wasn't data that was common to all the network operators. So as we move through time, you'll find that the methodology is improving as new data points are being collected. And then now we've been running common methodology for quite a while, we're finding that we're evaluating that methodology, we're seeing how the results that we predicted back in 2015 have changed based on, it's now the current year, 2023. How accurate were we? Did we have failures that we didn't detect? And could we have collected data relating to those failures? And so all this learning contributes to an evolving methodology. In the UK, we have, other than the exception of what we call ED1, which is electricity, which is RIIO ED1, which is a regulatory period from 2015 to 2023. All of our other regulatory periods have been 5 years. So that was a bit of an odd one, being 8 years. But we're now on 5-year cycles. And so common methodology is being improved and updated in 5-yearly intervals. So we're currently just started ED2, so that's 2023 to 2028. And we've just started common methodology version 2.1. So there's a bit of a versioning thing going on. So version 2 was the original version, but with old consequence and costs, and version 2.1 is essentially the same, but it's got new costs and things. So it's had a tiny bit of an update, but not a methodology update. We're currently with the GB DNOs working on CNAIM version 3. So we're starting to understand what that will look like, and that will involve more asset classes and potentially slightly different structured asset classes to what we currently have. So then, just to put a bit of a definition on the common methodology, so the full title, we call it CNAIM, is the Common Network Asset Indices Methodology, and it's for measuring health and criticality for electricity distribution assets. And as we go through these webinar sessions, we'll have a look, and if there are people from other industries on the call, then maybe we could have a look and see how they translate potentially to other environments. So as I say, we've started implementing this as part of actually a water challenge that Ofwat have awarded, and we're also doing it for renewables. So we're starting to look at what does this kind of methodology look like, say for a solar panel or for a water main, for example. So we can use some of these examples. So if there are people from other industries, we can potentially pick up on other examples other than electricity distribution ones. And so I think probably the rest of that slide I've gone through one way or another, so we'll move on. So how is it used? So this is a really broad brush of how it is used. So every asset has data associated with it, and then we put that data through a series of calculations, and each asset will come up with a probability of failure and a consequence of failure. So the probabilities of failure are banded into a HI1 to a HI5. So that's this part of the matrix, and then the criticality is 1 to 4. So a HI5 is the worst condition asset, and a C4 is the most highly critical asset. So C2 is an average asset. And so what we mean by criticality and an average is that if you think about a typical, I don't know, a typical HV or MV transformer, what's the typical number of customers, the typical environment, those sorts of things. Whereas that you're comparing that with an asset which is more strategically placed, because it services more customers. Maybe it has a higher safety impact because of its locality. Maybe because it doesn't have an oil containment system, the potential for oil leakage to the environment may be higher. So that's where you get these differences in criticality. So every asset gets plotted onto a matrix. And then the volume, so this is as the volumes. So for linear assets, it's kilometers of assets. So that's for your underground cables and for your overhead line conductors. And for plant and point assets, it's just single numbers. And so what the network operators do is they determine at the beginning of their price control, or in their plan, they will have the declared volumes based on what they currently know. They will declare the volumes at the end of the period, and they will find this out because the methodology has a mechanism of aging assets, and they will define what it looks like at the end with an investment plan in place. And then what Ofgem does is it looks at these matrices, and Ofgem doesn't care about the individual assets per se, but what it does care is how these assets move within the matrix and whether the money invested represents affordability and reliability on the network and is good for the customers, essentially, ultimately good for the customers. And so annual reporting is done, and delta movements within that matrix must be declared, and then there must be the evidence of spending. And in our regulatory system, if you don't hit the numbers that you said you're going to do, there are penalties associated with that. Now, just before I move on to the next slide, I saw a question asked about the transmission network. So with transmission in the UK, they were also given the same directive as from Ofgem to create a common methodology. Two of the network operators were using CBRM and could agree on a CBRM type approach, but one of the network operators wasn't. They were using their own custom designed methodology, and they formed a working group and got together, but they couldn't agree a common format that would work for all of them. And so what they agreed to do was produce their own methodologies, which they had to prove was equivalent to one another and produce the same outputs for the same types of asset in the same condition. So they had to go through this verification and validation process, and then Ofgem approved common methodology, important wording, but they agreed not to reject the transmission methodology. And I appreciate that's quite, it's sort of quite regulatory type speak, but yeah, so they haven't per se, you know, sort of approved the transmission network. So they currently report on, yeah, that they're slightly different and not exactly common. But if they do change their methodologies, they will, you know, need to go through another verification process. So they're not keen on doing that. So transmission is a little bit different, but there's plenty of transmission companies who are using a CBRM type approach, and we've also used CBRM or CNAIM, similar CNAIM type models for most of the asset classes. And I would say that it works for most of the asset classes for the health part of it, but once you get to the consequences, in particular when we're looking at network performance, there's more things to consider for transmission, so that becomes a little bit more complicated. So there's a maturity thing that goes on in place there. Okay, we'll move on. So in terms of the asset base that's covered by common methodology, as you'll see on the screen, so the blue on the screen are CNAIM, so you'll find this information in the final determination. So this is what Ofgem produced. So the CNAIM methodology assets make up about 2/3 of the asset base. So there are clearly some emissions there. And the reason for that is because they wanted to look at asset categories which they could both agree on and they had reasonable amounts of data on. But this is sort of changing now. So as we're looking towards CNAIM version 3, we are exploring what some of these other asset classes look like, and there's more on that in a little bit. But you can see there's you know, there's a lot of money associated with these different asset classes for CNAIM. So CNAIM governs an awful lot of the spending in the UK. And so if you're not part of the GB network operators, then you're probably wondering, well, how relevant is it to what I'm doing? So common methodology isn't a standard. It's not, you know, an ISO standard or anything like that, but it is a really good start. And it's mature, and there's lots of proven principles and structures and algorithms and everything in there. So it's a really useful reference. We've done a lot of research on the methodology in terms of proving some of these algorithms. So the algorithms we're using for the aging and probability of failure, the way that we look at DGA type analysis for oil tests, consequences of failure and the ways of combining. So there's a lot of research and a lot of understanding gone on there, and there's been an awful lot of testing. So like I say, this is, in one form or another, CBRM has been in place since around about 2000. So we've had 23 years of development and thinking that's gone into the methodology. So it absolutely has reference that anybody who's got fixed assets could probably pick it up and make use of it. As I mentioned before, it's designed to be, I'm going to say, relatively simple. So depending on where you come from and maturity, you might find this more or less complicated than what you're currently using. Deviation from the methodology is no longer common. So the methodology is designed for the UK with UK inputs, UK voltages and things. And so as soon as you deviate from that, it's not strictly common methodology, and you can't strictly benchmark yourself against the GB DNOs. But there are necessary changes that you will make to implement that in other environments. Things like costs and failure rates and things like that will need to be just adjusted slightly. Ofgem website does publish quite a lot of information that the GB DNOs provide to them. So we've got this openness of sharing data. So you can sort of broadly benchmark, but not quite the same. Common methodology doesn't account for nuances in fleets. So if you've got a particular concern, then it won't really address those concerns. So for example, bushfires are quite prevalent in certain parts of the world, and we've built models which include bushfire risk, for example, but that's not a massive thing here in the UK, so it doesn't, the methodology doesn't cater for things like that. And again, the sort of nuances in asset fleets is it doesn't go down to the level of type and manufacturer. So there might be further adaptations you might want to make if you want to use the methodology to make it really relevant and specific to yourselves. So quick look at the methodology itself. So the documents that we've got, so this is the latest document, version 2.1, published on the 1st of April 21. So you're right in thinking, if you're thinking that's 2 years ahead of when they need to use it, you're absolutely right. So like I say, we're looking at CNAIM version 3 at the minute for 2020, starting in 2028. And really, we've only got about 12 months to decide what's going into that, because it takes so long to get the business processes, to get the approval for the methodology, to test and check that everything is right before it actually gets used. And then, so business planning starts sort of way ahead, and we go through a process of draft and final determinations and things. And so we haven't got long to actually get that in place. So it sounds like a really long timeline, and it is, but we need that long timeline for everything to be put into place. As I mentioned, there's a version 1 of the methodology, or version 1.1 specifically, and there's a document that explains the changes between the 2 versions. I won't go into that now, but we'll explore some of the mechanisms that are in place there as we go through the webinar series. And then finally, we've got this good practice guide. This is not available yet, but it will be, and I'm told around about 2 weeks, but I keep on being told different timelines. So what they're trying to do with these 3 documents is publish them on the Energy Networks Association website. So ENA support the UK industry, and the network operators contribute to their funding, and they do a whole range of services, and these documents will all be published together as part of that website. The other 2 documents are available on either the Ofgem or the ENA website. I think this one is Ofgem and this one is the ENA website, and there's links to the document at the end of the webinar, and we'll share that with you. The good practice guide is very much anticipated by other organisations around the globe who are looking at CNAIM. And what that is it tells you for every data point that's used in the methodology, there is a photographic reference for what we mean by certain condition states. So it goes through all of the different assets, and it says that if you've recorded this asset as, say, severe deterioration, then this is an example picture of an asset with severe deterioration, and it points out the relevant bits as to why that is severe and not a different sort of asset rating or condition rating. So it's a really important document, and there's lots of more information in there about how to fill in and populate those data points. And the reason that's been necessary is for consistency. So in the UK, Ofgem wanted to make sure that if you're grading some asset as particular condition, they wanted that to be the same in the north of Scotland compared to London, and the depths of the Welsh valleys or wherever it happens to be. And so Ofgem are actually going through and checking that the network operators are conforming to a particular standard, so this becomes the standard. Like I say, not available yet, but as we go through these webinars, we'll hopefully put a link to that document. And so the structure of the common methodology, we will explore over future webinars, but essentially what we've got and what we've got in the document is we've got 2 halves to the methodology. So on the left-hand side on the screen, we've got elements that contribute to the condition of the asset. In the methodology, that's called a health score. And we have a relationship between the health score and the probability of failure of the asset. So that all appears on that side, and that makes up part of that 5x4 matrices. So in really tiny writing down here, we can see probability of failure HI1 to HI5. So that's where that comes in. And then on the right-hand side of the methodology, we've got consequence categories. So financial is broad to include both CapEx and OpEx, safety, environment, and network performance, or performance if it's, yeah. So that's what's happening with the asset and the impact of that asset not being available. And together they form the consequences of failure, which get turned into a C1 to C4, which I mentioned before. So this is how the 2 sides of the methodology get structured and put together. A little bit more on this side. So we form a health score, and the health score is actually a range of values, so a continuous scale from 0.5 to 10, where the principle of the methodology is that assets can't exceed beyond a HI 5.5, a health score of 5.5, if they don't have any condition-specific information that tells you that that asset is in poor condition. So we do have these magic sort of numbers within the methodology and some of the rules in terms of how we apply the methodology. Interestingly, as we start to move to other asset classes which generally have less data, we're looking at whether that 5.5 is relevant for those other asset classes, but we'll potentially talk more about that when we know what's going on with those asset classes. And as you can see, the HI bandings that are in place, they're not equal. This is the probability of failure curve that we use. So this is a bit of a snapshot into the methodology. So it has a flat bottom to the curve. So this takes account for regular failures, infant mortality, and all those sorts of things. So it's generally the same up until you get to about a health index of 4. And then we have this a sort of cubic equation, this relationship, which then sets, it's that way around for you guys on screen, sets the trajectory for the probability of failure. And this curve moves slightly depending on which asset classes it is and how fast assets are aging. But that's the general shape of what we use. And then a little bit more on the consequences. This is a little bit of a teaser for future webinars. So all the consequences are distilled down into monetized values. And the benefit of this is that we can look at any of the monetized values for any of the asset types, and we can sum them all up. So it means that even for safety and environmental consequences, we can actually put some numbers on these. And the methodology has been really good in defining what those numbers are actually going to be, and it looks at reference documents and things. So when we're looking at what the impact is, for example, of an oil spill or injuring somebody, then we do have some reference numbers that we can go and look at. And then we've got criticality bands here. So the criticality bands are done slightly different to the health. What we do with the criticality bands is that every asset type, we have an average asset and then we move around the average, but the asset, and so the percentage of each individual asset compared to the average asset is applied to create our criticality band. So for an average asset, that falls into a C2 band. So if it's more critical than average, then we end up with a C4 band or C3 band, depending on exactly how critical that is. So within the methodology documents, you'll see that we can drill down into the methodology in much more detail than that high level view with the 2 slides that I show you. So this is the health score and how the health score is made up. So it's slightly more complicated, as you would expect, than just looking at those boxes. We actually can expand, and now we have elements of current health score, initial health score, and all the things that go into making that. And then if we drill down further into the methodology, you'll see that, so this is for location. I'll just go back one. So location appears up here. So this is just one component. And then if we expand, say, location, you can see this is the output over here, this location. Inputs are in orange. So the methodology uses distance from coast, altitude and corrosion, and whether the asset's indoor or outdoor, and also an asset register category. So this is the asset type, essentially. So all this information comes in. We also have calibration, which is represented in blue, and calculations, which are in the white colour, and sort of decision points in terms of how the algorithms and the assets are actually calculated. So there's lots of detail in there, which we'll explore, and we'll also explore the calculations for every step. So a few of the calculations are already on screen, so we'll explore those for future webinars, but they are all defined within the methodology. And also defined are prescribed inputs and configuration values. So this is an example of the data requirements for HV switchgear, primary switchgear, and you've got all the data points listed and all the allowable values that those data points can take. So, for example, switchgear external condition is described as an observed condition measure, and it can only have one of, I think it's 4 data points. So each asset must be either no deterioration, superficial minor, some deterioration, or that substantial deterioration I mentioned earlier. And then up here we've got just lists of information relating to the failure curves. So K value relates to the failure rates, C value relates to the shape of the curve. Again, we'll explore this in more detail. And again, the different data points have got their own what we call calibration associated with them. So factors, caps and collars, all of which we will discover through the webinar series. So in terms of asset categories, so what's in the methodology? So network operators report against 104 asset categories, of which 61 are within common methodology. That's the broader group, what we call asset register categories. And of those, they're distilled down into 25 main groups. And so for the LV network, we've got link boxes, pillars, circuit breakers, poles. For the HV network, sort of similar with transformers. Submarine cables comes in there. For the EHV and 132 kV networks, so EHV, so I should say HV in the UK is at 6.6 and 11 kV. EHV is 33, generally 33 and 66 kV. So we've got towers and tower fittings, conductors, all sorts of cables in there, switchgear, transformers, poles. Yeah, so there's quite a lot that it does cover. Like I say, that represents about 2/3 of what the network operators, physical assets the network operators have, and then what's not in. So these relate to 43 of those 104 categories. So there's quite a lot of LV stuff that's not in there. So main conductors, service cables, cables in general on the HV network. For the EHV and 132 kV networks, they tend to be they tend to be small numbers of assets that were just not included because there were lots of asset categories already, and we didn't quite get there, or they didn't quite get there for common version 1. So between version 1 and version 2, there's no new asset categories. There are other changes. When you look at these asset categories, so mains cables for LV represents just over 5% of the spending in the UK for ED2, so that's quite a big chunk. And HV cables represents just under 5, about 4.6% spending. So adding those two together, and you get almost another 10% of asset coverage. So some of these groups, you know, will contribute a lot. So this is where we're concentrating our efforts on CNAIM version 3, is where we can get the most coverage and what's viable to do and what can be common. So that's what we're currently looking at as part of a working group. So just before I go on to the webinar series, which is really quick, just another question. So what is the source of failure rate used in the methodology? Is it failure rate from suppliers or from industry standard? So the failure rates in the methodology originate from, there's a couple of things, but they actually originate from the fact that all of the network operators had CBRM, and they all had their own failure rates in there. And so they all had an understanding of how many assets were failing per year. Plus they also record the failures in a system called NAFAs. So they keep their own failure records as well. We do have a future webinar relating wholly to failures and what happens if you haven't got things like failure rates. Failure rates are actually quite difficult, but we have had to agree on a particular failure rate. And the reason they're quite difficult is because lots more assets would fail if we didn't replace them. And so true failure rates are actually quite hard. So we also need to look at what assets have come off the network because they're no longer viable and in imminent, risk of failure. And then there's also the aspect of, we're not just looking at these catastrophic failures, we're also looking at what's classed in common methodologies, incipient failures and degraded failures. So can't quite remember the exact numbers, but I think incipient failures are failures where remediation is up to about 10% of the total asset value, the capital value of the asset. And then I think degraded is about 25%, but there's some examples in there. So as network operators are also going out and fixing these less serious failures, they're recording those as well, whether or not, you know, there is any loss of supply as a result of that particular failure. So things like failure to trip, for example, would be classed as potentially an incipient failure in switchgear, not circuit breakers. So you do also get those other failure types, but there's a lot of records with regards to the types of failure and failure modes and failure categories actually in the methodology. And like I say, we'll explore those through the webinar series as well. But yeah, really interesting question. Yeah. So in terms of the webinar series then, so the next one of these that we'll do is going to relate to the initial health score. So this is where we unpick age, location, duty factor, and you might have seen it from the previous screen, the initial health index, which sort of comes in round about here, although it's not depicted on this particular diagram. And the things we're going to look at are, we will identify all the data points that relate to those elements, and we'll do that for each of the webinars as we go through. So these are the primary switchgear data points, so we'll explore all of those and where they come into the methodology. We'll show you exactly how the methodology is broken down in terms of all the elements that get fed up. So this is into making the sort of higher level elements. So these are those diagrams I showed you before, but we'll depict them so they're a little bit less complicated. We're going to look at some of these definitions and algorithms. So all of these algorithms that sit within the methodology, we'll unpick those, we'll put some definitions on them, we'll tell you what the typical ranges and things are like. So if you are thinking about taking this away and applying it to your own assets, you'll get some guidance there as to how to calibrate the methodology. And then finally, we'll do some worked examples as well. So we'll show you combination of sort of software and Excel during these sessions. We will show you exactly how these work with some different inputs and how the numbers actually are generated. So that's what we're planning to do in all of these sort of methodology workshops. So the first one is the initial health score. So the second one, or webinar 3, is current health score. And so we'll do all of these sections up to the current health score. Webinar 4 is probability of failure. It's quite a big topic, this. So as you imagine, you've got all the failure rates and things that come into there, the different shapes of the curve that we use, and also a lot of the reasoning behind what we use. So that will come into probability of failure. And then we're going to go over to the right-hand side for webinar 5. So we're looking at consequences of failure. And then webinar 6 will be risk and reporting. So we'll show you how all the reporting is used in a bit more detail. And then we have webinar 7 and 8 as well. So 7 is going to look at specifically at the transformer health formulation. So specifically higher voltage transformers. This is where we've got the oil data coming in, and we've also got a tap change component. So we can spend a bit of time exploring that in a bit more detail, because it's a bit of an oddball one where we're actually taking raw oil test values and we're processing those and doing something with them. So that's worthy of a webinar of its own. And then the final one, we're going to look at data mapping, data quality, and everything around just getting the models to go. So those are the different webinars. There's one a month. They extend all the way to next year. And so we're just about on time. So yeah, we've got a few minutes for questions and answers. Yeah, so if anybody's got any questions, please shout up. Feel free to unmute yourself, yeah, to ask any questions.
Thanks very much, John. That was very interesting. I can just make a wee request. Can I have a copy of that last slide with all the monthly webinars, because it would be
Yes.
great for me and my colleagues. I've got a bit of involvement with CNAIM, but not a great depth. But that might increase in the future, so that would be a big help as well.
Yeah, sure. We'll send the slide pack round, and feel free for
even
any
better.
of you and your colleagues. So which company are you from,
Yeah.
John?
Yeah, I'm Spain. I'm in the asset
You're
management
Spain.
team. Yeah, so
Yeah.
there's other people here involved more intensely with CNAIM, but I have a wee bit of involvement every now and again. So this was I came on here for educational purposes more than anything else. You know.
Yeah, no,
Good
really
stuff.
good. Yeah.
Yeah, it's worth mentioning that the slide deck, will share that out after the session, but equally they contain the links for registration on the next
Yeah,
events as well.
brilliant.
So that'd be perfect. Yeah, no problem at all.
Fantastic.
Yeah. Hi, John.
Hi.
John Dunning. Hi, yeah. Just want to say thank you very much for that. I'm involved with maintenance strategies, you see, for our company. So
Okay.
it's something we might take going forward. So I'll make sure I can attend these. Okay, but thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. I think, are we going to put them on the internet as well, Chris, if on our YouTube channel as well?
Yes,
just in
absolutely.
case?
Yeah, I mean, if ever you do miss any of the sessions or can't make the sessions, we are recording them for exactly that purpose, really, so that we can share a recording if you do miss any. So yeah, we'll make those available too. No problem.
It's all quiet on the questions. I'll just move forward then, just to say that links and information sources. So obviously give us a shout if there's any questions regarding anything that you've seen, or you know, save them for the next session or whatever, but we're always contactable. The documents, we've put the links to those, and also the changes explained, and we've also written a bit of a blog about the changes as well. So it's I'd like to think it's a little bit less dry than this version. So if you've got a couple of hours, read through this, and if you've only got 15 minutes, maybe read the blog about the changes. But they may not make much sense until we've kind of gone through the webinar sessions and you understand, you know, the full format of the methodology. Yeah, so we got anything else? So just a bit about what we do. So obviously we are sort of promoting the methodology in terms of exploring it with people. We want other people to use it, and we're exploring the use and adaptation of it, and we have our own software and systems, and we help customers with investment decisions and consultancy and things like that. So this is the only salesy bit that you'll get at the end of our webinars, just to keep you informed about what we do, and if you have any questions about you know, what services and things we can provide, then please do ask. But yeah, that's a sort of secondary thing.
Hi Joe, it's Terry Green here. How you doing?
Hi. Hi.
Really enjoyed the presentation.
Thank you.
One thing purely from only a personal educational perspective, was there any associated CPD you could claim for these sessions?
CPD, sorry.
It's
I know. Sorry, professional development.
Yeah. I know it's a long, it's far ask, but I just wonder if there was anything that could be attributed to any official CPD hours accruement.
It's a very interesting question, actually, and possibly something we can raise with our. Obviously we have a dedicated skill centre for training delivery and things. It's a valid question, actually, and something I can potentially raise with those around that. Yeah.
We will.
Okay, I'll watch the space.
Yes.
Yeah. Thanks for the question, Terry.
No worries.
Okay.
Any other questions at this point? No.
I think they'll be putting the questions at the subsequent webinars, you know.
Yeah, saving them all up.
Definitely.
Absolutely.
I've given you all lots to think about. So yeah, have a look at the documentations if you get time before the next session, and yeah, we'll hopefully see you register on the next one, and yeah, we can delve into the detail. Devil's in the detail. All right. Thanks very much, everybody.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Thanks all.
Thank you for joining.
Bye.